Hi, everybody. Welcome to yet another episode of the Observe It podcast. I'm super excited to welcome a friend of mine, Austin Parker. We go a long way back at Lightstep. But I'll hand it over to you, Austin, for intros.
Hello, thank you for having me. I am, as mentioned, Austin Parker. I am director of open source at Honeycomb. I'm a member of the OpenTelemetry governance committee, a longtime contributor to observability projects and writing and so many other things. Um, I wanted to actually, I was continuing a thought we were having before we started recording. But one thing I think is so cool about you doing this is that there's so many people that talk about observability, but it's always like from the perspective of I've got something to sell you. I'm either trying to pitch you on open telemetry or I'm trying to sell you on a product or a tool or solution or whatever. But I think it's awesome to see like someone like you that's gone from one side of the table to the other, getting back out there and talking about it as more from that end user perspective or that oh, I'm consuming the fruits of this industry versus I'm growing them.
Yeah, and actually, I'll tell you, part of what sort of motivated this was, we started having some internal debates on how we should do this and, whether to use OTel and how to use OTel. And a lot of the fundamental issues I talk to people about are pretty far away from sort of some of the expert issues that we talk about. I hope that this is helpful for those audiences that's like pretty far away from using observability and really picking up the basics.
Yeah, I'll go ahead and just drop some bombs right off the bat. Then I think one of the biggest ways that sort of observability has let people down as a discipline is we've made it way too hard. Like and I think we get. I don't think it's out of malice or and it's not out of like trying to overcomplicate things. It's just like you said, when you get into the echo chamber and you start doing things, you're looking at the world from a different level. You're seeing it from the 30,000 foot view. There's a really interesting, practical example here of open telemetry. We spent so long trying to get metrics right, and from a specification perspective, right? It took probably a year longer than we had planned on, if that, maybe longer when you get down to it. But a lot of the reason why is because it just like there was a bunch of people who have been struggling with these problems at ridiculous levels of scale, at your Googles, your Metas, whatever, and saw like what happens when you try to go over a certain point and to push metrics, distributions, and summaries and histograms and stuff like that to their logical extent, and see where they break and fall down. And when you're sitting at the table for what is effectively a standards building project, which is what OpenTelemetry has become, right? Like
Yep.
we're not just some little thing anymore. We are like the de facto standard for um, telemetry for cloud native apps, and quickly becoming the de facto standard for like all performance telemetry. But when you're looking at it from that perspective and you're thinking like, okay, my time horizon is I need to write a spec that's going to be good for like 10 years, 15 years. You make different decisions. You prioritize different things. And that is usually a distinction that a lot of people don't see, and they probably shouldn't necessarily have to care about it, right? Like if I'm writing a web app, I probably don't want to know or even care about the details of like what went into that process of making the 15-year metrics spec.
Yeah.
I just want it to work.
Yeah, and just, like, to make it easy for me, right? Just
Yeah.
make the code simple, make the instrumentation simple, make the spec simple for me to understand to do the bare bones, the bare basics.
And that's where we leave people behind a lot, I think, as observability practitioners, to kind of use a word from the past. It's become a little bit ivory tower in ways that I don't think anyone really ever wanted it to be. And I think a lot of this comes back to the state of the art is still changing very rapidly. We're making a lot of innovations and advancements just within, the past 5 years, right? Like stuff changes a lot, and unless it is your full-time job to like know all that, you're probably not going to be aware of it. So you depend on your tools, and you depend on vendors or the open source community or whoever to kind of package it all up for you very neatly. But because OpenTelemetry is, acting as this big forcing function, sort of black swan event almost, nobody's caught up. So there's a lot of people that are over here at the edge of OpenTelemetry talking about all the cool things you'll be able to do, and we're not necessarily serving all the people that are kind of stuck. I don't want to say in the past, but you know, who don't have the luxury of just like throwing everything out and going into that.
So then I guess one thought that occurred to me, do you think that then the larger companies, the enterprises with more resources to dedicate to observability are better in a better position to benefit from open telemetry?
I see it right now as like it's the people in the middle that tend to lose out. So I think yes, at like the big enterprise level, if you're, a big bank, F500 company, whatever, and you have a dedicated platform engineering function that is trying to figure out what does the internal development platform look like for the next, 10 years that we can roll out to 10,000 developers across the world, sure, OTel makes a lot of sense for you then, right? Because you like that level of control, you like the customization, you like the flexibility, you like the standards, da 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 da. Da. And we are seeing as a project a lot of adoption from that layer, that level of organization. But I think what's interesting is the other side of this, right? If you're brand new, if you're going out there and you're a solo founder, or you got your five people on a Zoom call or whatever, OpenTelemetry makes a lot of sense for you as well because it preserves optionality. I was talking to a very small startup, and what they decided to go with was, their actual conclusion was like, well, we really don't need a big commercial service right now. We don't need a paid proprietary thing because we're not at that scale yet, and we can't necessarily justify the expense. And as long as we're instrumented with open telemetry, and as long as we're using traces and all these signals and blending them together, then we can use kind of the built-in stuff on our cloud provider to get some basic metrics and logs and traces. And then in the future, when we need something bigger and better, we just point that data somewhere else. So if you're at those extremes, yeah, it works great. Where it falls down, I think, is if you're in the middle. If you're in the like small to medium sized business, you have a couple hundred, maybe a couple thousand employees total, and you've got hundreds of engineers, tens to hundreds of engineers. You're not well served by OpenTelemetry today, and you're not really that well served by a lot of the analysis tools today.
We started using open telemetry metric when it hadn't reached sort of stable yet, quote unquote. And there was just too many changes, right? Like we wanted to move with the changes, but then the changes would break something. And honestly, we just had a million other things
Yeah,
to handle in our stack. So at some point, the good thing was that it did allow us to evaluate several different vendors and then ended up picking one that was most cost effective and sort of a good user experience. So that is like definitely 100% a win. But yeah, the part where like I think we just caught it at the wrong time, right? And it's just like things weren't mature to the point where we could do it once and then look away. So that was like a very sort of specific pain point that we had.
like the nice thing about logging and OpenTelemetry. Um, Actually, I presume this will be out after KubeCon.
Yes.
Okay, so at KubeCon, we're announcing that logging is kind of GA, right? Which
Oh
logging
wow.
is stable. Now, here's the thing, and this is what catches people quite often, is that we've made a lot of pronouncements in OpenTelemetry over the years about things being GA or stable, right? And it's true. We're not, being misleading, but there's a difference between like it's stable in the spec and you can go grab the Ruby SDK and use
Yep.
it, for
Yep.
example, right? And so what we're saying is like, hey, this is stable in the spec. And so when you see this roll out in an OTel SDK and API, that is stable code. That is not going to change. That is now, you have like years of this isn't going to break. But yes, like even after metrics API, metrics in the spec was stable, but it still took months. Go just like a couple months ago released, stable metrics in the Go SDK.
Yep.
So that pathway from hey, we've stabilized this in the specification to, hey, this is available, and production ready, or at least this is not going to change on you, is a long one. It can be a long one. Logging shouldn't be as bad for most people because logging is not this whole new API. Logging is a bridge. So what we're doing with logs and OpenTelemetry is working with, sort of the existing logging APIs in all these languages and then bridging them to the OpenTelemetry SDK. So in Java, for example, using like log4j or whatever logger you like, there's a bridge that will take those, logs and send them to the OpenTelemetry SDK as a sync, and then the OpenTelemetry SDK will take those logs, convert them to OpenTelemetry format, add any kind of resource attributes or whatever else, and ship them on. Now, the nice thing about this is since it's all going through the same SDK, if you also are tracing, so if you have an active span, while a log is emitted, we will attach that trace ID to that log message. So you can kind of easily pivot between logs and traces. And I think that's that's where we were trying to get to all those years ago, right? Like when we started OpenTelemetry in 2019, like that was really the dream. Is that, yeah, I've got all this telemetry and it's all associated very closely together with trace IDs, shared semantic conventions.
The misunderstanding that you talked about, we had that, right? So part of the frustration that we had was, the constant changes, but also the inconsistencies between, like, we use multiple language. So we had Java, Go, Rust, and Rust, we had to do something completely custom. And for us, it was just like, oh, and we had Python as well, right? So it's just like discovering that, oh, it works this way in this SDK and this way and that. Of course, it's an open source project and we cut
Yeah,
issues and but again, like, it's just the cognitive expectation, like, the cognitive dissonance between, like, "Oh, the spec says it's ready," and then that trickling down to all the other actual instrumentation libraries.
it's a difficult balance that we have to kind of make as maintainers and as project leaders, right? Because we need we need to be able to represent, like, hey, this is good enough to use, because it is. Like, we have there are, again, thousands of companies and organizations worldwide using OpenTelemetry in production and getting a lot of value out of it. Um, if you're too cautious about how you talk about it, then you're going to scare people away. You're going to be, people are going to be like, well, I don't want to adopt this. It's going to,
Of course. Yeah.
constantly break or whatever. If you're too, optimistic, then you're going to get a lot of like unhappy users. It If I had to like do a harsh self crit, I would say we've probably erred on the side of like, hey, this is more ready than it is. But on the other hand, but would I have done it differently? Probably not. I think the reason it's become better is because people have started using it and started giving us feedback on it and telling us, hey, this doesn't work. you know?
Well, you need some of the pioneers, right,
Yeah.
in order to make progress.
Yeah, exactly. And we've done, I think, a pretty good job, at least for a lot of like really core components, like metrics being sort of the big outlier, right? Like the metrics stuff went through a big change. There was a lot of stuff that was in there that came from Open Census, and then we kind of rebooted the whole thing. And so that caused a lot of grief for people because it's like, well, I had metrics yesterday and now I have them today and they're different. Tracing though, like tracing didn't necessarily have that problem as badly, I think.
Yeah, no, tracing's pretty solid.
Right, like there wasn't a open tracing and open census were very similar to begin with in terms of like what does a trace look like, what does a span look like. So that was a smaller lift.
Yeah. I don't even remember where I saw this, but I saw it on your, one of your social media platforms that you were asking people straight up, like, "Hey, do you think OTel is easy to use?" And I remember a lot of people said no. And in my head, I was like, I gotta ask Austin how he responds to these things, like what his reaction is, what is he gonna champion for to help fix this? Because I think it's hard to hear. I think it's hard to hear if you're a maintainer and, a lot of people are coming to you and saying, "Hey, Austin, this is really hard to use." It's hard to understand.
Maybe, but like, I mean, feedback's a gift, right? Like, I would much rather people come to me and say, "Hey, this sucks. Hey, you're off base here," rather than not say anything. Because if someone comes to you and says, "Hey, this sucks," they cared enough about it to tell you it sucks.
Yep.
So if someone comes to me and says like, "Hey, OpenSWIM is hard to use," or "Hey, I'm having this bad experience," then that I would obviously love to hear about your successes, right? Like, I want to hear about the good things, but I would rather you tell me like where it's not working versus not telling me that it's not working. So, in the context of what's wrong with Hotel, there's a lot of really good feedback on it, and I think the things that I see as being pretty common patterns are that obviously it changes a lot, and I think that one big common theme is like, hey, we would like it to settle down somewhat. And the other one is it's just a little hard to use. Like the ergonomics of it aren't great.
Mhm.
And you all have a client, SDK. If people don't like actually writing your code, they're not going to, right? So if we actually believe, if we really mean that OpenTelemetry, the best way to get value out of tracing in OpenTelemetry is to write custom instrumentation, then it needs to be really, really delightful to write that custom instrumentation. It needs to be really easy to set up that SDK and to get this data out. And in a lot of ways, it isn't right now. So one of my priorities kind of for the next couple of years is going to be really helping us become more responsive to that use case of like application developers and helping to make it easier for them to write that custom instrumentation. Um, I think the other thing is that we actually see this really big split that kind of comes up between who owns these problems at different orgs. So, especially in your like larger org, developers don't really own metrics and traces and logs and stuff, right? It's usually an operations concern. So, like, an ops person will get some agent or automatic instrumentation, whatever, and they'll throw that into their cluster or onto their host, and that will give them the telemetry. And devs aren't really incentivized to care about it. Now, I think OpenTelemetry can be a vehicle to change this, but again, we go back to it needs to be a lot more conventional. It needs to be a lot more idiomatic. It needs to be a lot easier for those devs to write the code. And it needs to be easier for them to see the value of writing that code. Like there has to be carrots along with the sticks.
Yeah, it becomes an organizational or like a human problem, right? The incentives aren't aligned or I mean, there's just a lot to do day to day. Everybody's busy.
Oh yeah.
So just like, well, intellectually, there's like a burden there. If they don't know anything about it already, then there's like adopting this like new mindset or new tools, new concepts. I don't know. I think, people get tired and they don't they don't want to learn.
I think it goes back to like that what I was talking about earlier too, right? We're not with people not seeing the value or the value not being like evenly distributed. You know, because had some really interesting feedback recently about some phrases, and it was around this idea of observability for high performing teams. And it turns out that it turned off a lot of people because they did not feel like they were on a high performing team, right? They felt like, oh, so this thing you're making is for someone else, not me. My team is not high performing. I can't use this. And it's like, that's it's kind of sad in a way, right? Like, no, I don't think anyone likes to feel like they're going to work and it's shitty. They don't want to feel like, oh, we're doing a bad job. But I would guesstimate that most people probably don't feel like they're on high performing teams. Like they feel like that's something that other people do. They're just trying to keep their head above water,
Yep. Yep.
and that really should influence. That helps me think because it's like, am I talking about these problems in ways that are accessible, that are inclusive to that variety of people without being insulting or without being like dismissive, right? Because it can be very easy to unintentionally come off as like, oh, I don't like this isn't for you. We don't really care about your problem or use case. When in reality, we're just trying to balance this Gordian knot of complexity that OpenTelemetry has created, where you know, to finish our existing commitments. We have to responsibly like expand our scope and bring in new signals and bring in new tools and expand the ecosystem. And in a lot of ways, we need to like help push towards a better model of this for everyone. Something that's not quite so like vertically integrated, and something that's a lot more open, like truly open and customizable and built in. I I think in a perfect world, if you're a developer, you don't necessarily have to care about OpenTelemetry because OpenTelemetry is already there. And when you're writing code, you either have tools or assistants, or you have, just the language standard library itself, making sure that this good contextual information, these attributes and whatever, are being added for you, and or it's telling you like, hey, you should, your GitHub Copilot equivalent is saying like, well, hey, if you should probably add this, add some attributes here with your customer ID or whatever into this span.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. The inclusivity one is really interesting to me because with the open source community, the whole mission, the whole vision is to include as many people as possible across all levels, across
Well,
various roles.
yeah, I mean, I think it's one of the, like there's a criticism of open source, right? Like you can like a public park is open, but it is not necessarily inclusive. You can build a public park with no ramps. You can build a public park and have the cops come in and chase you out. So there's a difference between like accessibility, inclusivity, and openness.
Yep.
And I will say, like as a foundation, like the CNCF cares about like that distinction and also cares about accessibility. Like I feel like there's a lot more OpenTelemetry could do to make this full circle again. Like conversations like this and having people like you give your experience is really useful.
I hope so.
Yeah.
I had a before we wrap up here, I had a question about your specific sort of approach.
Sure.
You know, you've just entered a new role, super exciting. What are some of the things that you really want to get done in your new role that's coming up? That's really exciting to you.
Oh gosh. I hate answering this question because I feel like I'm writing checks for my future self that I know are going to bounce.
It's all aspirational, right?
Yeah, well, this is aspirational. Well, one thing that is not an aspiration that is going to be completed, I'm very excited about is I'm really excited to finish writing my new book called Learning Open Telemetry, which will be out early next year from O'Reilly Publishing. I wrote this with my good friend Ted Young. We're shooting for something a little different in terms of, there's a lot of books and guides on how to write Open Telemetry code, but there's nothing that talks about how to learn open telemetry and implement it as like a holistic part of your system. And so that's what we're shooting for. It's in early release on the O'Reilly Learning platform now. If you'd like to go get an early look at it, I'm also, yeah, also really excited about some work I'm doing with the open source community more generally to help bring observability into more open source projects. So this is kind of an experiment right now, but we recently announced with the Linux Foundation that Honeycomb has become part of their open source partner program. So if you are a Linux Foundation or Cloud Native Computing Foundation project, and you would like observability tooling for your CI/CD, for just running things in dev and test, for whatever it is that you're doing, you can get a free or a complimentary paid Honeycomb account. So to learn more about that, go to the Linux Foundation open source programs website.
Awesome. That's great. So, sounds like what really a lot of the grander theme of what you're trying to do is, more education, obviously more advocacy, but pushing more and more tools and just things for people to use in the open source community, right? So everything is transparent and hopefully accessible as well.
Yeah, I think observability, it's more than an aspiration, it's more than a goal, it's more than a nice to have. I think it's a right. It's what got me into this field to begin with was way too many 3 a.m., 4 a.m., getting woken up, trying to figure out what was broken on some distributed system. And I can't stop people from getting woken up, and I can't stop systems from breaking, but I can make it so that you can get back to sleep a lot quicker.
Yep.
So let's all work together,
It's a very powerful statement.
yeah, to get back to sleep quicker.
Yeah, for sure, and everybody cares about that, so the incentives are aligned there for sure. Well, it's been great catching up with you today, Austin. Thank you so much for sharing your perspective. There are golden tidbits that we touched upon today that I think we could spend a whole nother hour expanding upon, but we'll leave that for a later episode. And I'll also want to be respectful of your time. So,
Hey, good. Like I said, if you want more of Trenchant Insights, please find me on LinkedIn, Austin Parker.
okay. Thank you to the viewers and the listeners as well.